You can now get my new book, Royal Cryptocracy: Ancient Intelligence Networks in Enlightenment and Communism. The link is in the description below. Whether you already know many things about history and intelligence networks or not, you will be confronted in this book with new ideas and conclusions about the most important events of the last 300 years. It is not based on a silly gimmick, not on a massive digital data dump handed to me by a government whistleblower, not on a defector from Russia, not on a unicorn insider source, not on government files that were left accidentally on a laptop in a train, not on conspiracy mythology, and also not on some propaganda campaign intended to benefit political parties or candidates. It is a gigantic puzzle, assembled with the help of many great researchers from different countries who were all unknowingly working on different parts of that very same puzzle. When you analyze empires and their intelligence networks, you can't just fall back on a rule of thumb, as if the simplest explanation was the best one. This often leads people to employ simplistic ideological explanation patterns, or the cop-out generic view that ruling personalities were simply stupid and narcissistic. Empires themselves, and especially larger intelligence operations, can be very complex. The metric we are looking for to judge a hypothesis is how well does it fit the fundamental ways empires and intelligence networks operate. Sure, they make mistakes, sometimes even big ones, while applying their playbook, but they do have a playbook. You will see that my analysis of past networks and operations makes a lot more sense than the grossly misleading assumption by standard historians, and even those who specialize in intelligence topics, that before the 20th century, no truly large and professional intelligence capabilities existed. Supposedly, Britain ran its vast empire in which the sun never settled without vast intelligence networks. Only in the 20th century did they haphazardly improvise and freed up some office space for that purpose. According to Tim Weiner's best-selling book about the CIA, the United States made do without any real foreign intelligence service until the OSS was created out of thin air and staffed with adventurists and lawyers from Yale. Recent studies show that even ancient Rome was saturated with professional intelligence structures, even though they were not monolithic bureaucratic entities, but instead in the hands of select families who had the necessary funds and experience. This method was carried over into the later European empires, but historians have been paradoxical about this. They know aristocrats needed information for everything, schemed as hard as they could, and had all the elements needed for serious networks. Many historical works at least touch upon individual operations and organized foreign intelligence gathering, yet still, older intelligence capabilities are downplayed to the point where mostly covert diplomacy, dinner party whispering, and some military snooping are left for the reader. For Americans and Brits, the key to understanding their own countries lies in Germany, of all places. More precisely in the scattered territories of the Welfs, Wettins and Reginarids. They initially did not have one single large and easy to defend territory, and no large standing army, so they placed their hopes in bigger intelligence capabilities and bigger family structures. Their intelligence networks expanded to neighboring Denmark and then moved into Scotland, created the early iteration of Freemasonry, and married a Danish princess to the British King James. Later, William III from the Dutch House of Orange-Nassau finally took over England in the Glorious Revolution, and then the Hanoverian Welfs took over. King George III stopped military operations against George Washington, but continued the hostilities indefinitely through his intelligence networks. Allowing Washington to win militarily had the added benefit of keeping the French at a distance in America. The high nobility controlled its own Enlightenment movement through the new British Freemasonry and its scientific sister organization, Royal Society, while Germany and France were destabilized with pseudo-Enlightenment front organizations such as the Bavarian Illuminati Order. Around the same time, aristocratic intelligence infiltrated and took over the socialist movements. The events that unfolded in Russia have never been properly reconstructed in terms of aristocratic covert operations. Some of these families, like those from the Welfen cluster, had been around for 1200 years or more. In 1714, the Welfen king George I had ascended to the British throne. He was originally from the German territory of Hanover. Almost nobody today has any idea how big these families were. They were perfectly equipped to establish and expand their own intelligence networks. They had the personnel, the tight family connections, and the money. These networks did not cease to exist in the 20th century when bureaucratic intelligence services started. The old network of the Russian tsars was built with help from their British relatives, and it had thoroughly infiltrated the communist groups. At the same time, the communists somehow spilled over into the network of the Tsar, and during the following decades, Britain was responsible for some of the greatest intelligence failures. The Cambridge Five and the atomic spies were only part of this. Even MI5 director Hollis was under suspicion, and Lord Louis Mountbatten himself, whose close relatives on the throne had access to all British intelligence. If Britain's high nobility was compromised or had a secret alliance with the communist Soviet Union, this would have also compromised older clandestine British networks in the United States that were established after the Revolutionary War. King George III may have seemed mentally fragile and only of limited power, but he was just one man from a gargantuan family cluster. Britain seized military action against the Americans and signed a peace treaty, but the empire surely mounted an intelligence offensive that has never been reconstructed by intelligence historians. This would explain the strangely high level of success of communist espionage. The worries of James Jesus Angleton from the CIA's counterintelligence division that the United States had been infiltrated at the highest levels became legendary. Scores of anti-communists could never really explain why the Soviet espionage was so successful, despite the communists never having invented a single new intelligence technique. It is clear that the Welfs, Wettins and Reginarids could cause epic damage if they had traitors in their midst who shared intelligence with Soviet Russia. Or they had another secret relationship with the communists. But the true size of the family cluster and how far it reaches back turns this issue into the biggest possible intelligence nightmare in history. The average person assumes the core British royal family has maybe 100 members, judging from televised crownings and weddings. Pompous buffoons who lost control a long time ago, just like the Russian Tsars or the French kings or the Prussian Hohenzollern or the Austrian Habsburgs. Let me introduce you to the largest, oldest, most successful family cluster in recorded history. You have probably never heard the names Welfs, Wettins and Reginarids in your life, and that is exactly how they wanted it to be. Those three lines contain sub-lineages with names that should be a lot more familiar, because they also describe the places in Germany which they controlled: Hessen, Schleswig-Holstein, Mecklenburg, Sachsen, Hanover, Braunschweig, etc. For the longest time, Germany was not a unified empire, but simply a patchwork of different mini-kingdoms, principalities and countdoms. Some were allies, some were enemies. The Welfs can be traced back to the year 800, while they themselves see their origins in even older times, right after the fall of Rome. Just like the Wettins and Reginarids, they used the advantages of size, loyalty and intelligence capabilities. They usually try to have up to 10 or more legitimate children per couple, and often there were up to 50 additional illegitimate offspring. If someone did not inherit an official title, they could still be valuable assets under a normal name. This makes it difficult to count them all and trace them throughout history. Today's internet is of course a time-saving tool when it comes to databasing the three-dimensional spider's web of these people. A large family is the ideal prerequisite for running a secret service. And the nobility controlled the institutions to train military officers, intelligence officers, scientists, politicians, and industrialists. It was possible to cultivate lower-grade aristocratic families and even recruit new talents from the general population. The vetting process was slow and meticulous. A new recruit had to prove his loyalty for the rest of his life, and his children were then able to follow into the footsteps and possibly rise even higher. Winston Churchill, for example, goes back to the noble Marlborough family, who loyally served the Welfs for centuries. The nobility could use their own illegitimate children with innocuous names to hold certain positions, and it was easy to create cover identities if necessary. The Welfs, Wettins and Reginarids expanded into neighboring Denmark, and this was the staging area for the infiltration of Scotland, which then became a staging area for the infiltration of Britain. King James was of Stuart descent and was baptized a Catholic. However, in 1589 he married Anna of Denmark, daughter of King Frederick II of Denmark. Frederick's mother was Dorothea of Sachsen-Lauenburg, whose grandfather was Henry I of Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel. Friedrich married Sophie of Mecklenburg, and in addition to his daughter Anna, had 6 other children who married into Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel, Schleswig-Holstein-Gottorp, and the House of Saxony. So, King James was now close to the cluster of Welfs, Wettins and Reginarids. The French royalty and the Catholic Church weren't amused. In 1605, Catholic agents inside the Jesuit order attempted to kill the British royal family and parliamentarians with a massive explosion. When King George I took over Britain in 1714, he kept the scientific organization called Royal Society and attached to it the new British Freemasonry. British Freemasonry started in 1717 officially, yet it is actually an older organization from Scotland. Now, Scotland, of course, was infiltrated by these aristocratic networks. These organizations were then used for a controlled version of the Enlightenment. Robert Lomas, the author of The Invisible College about the history of the Royal Society, is himself a Freemason and describes how on the famous Rosslyn Chapel in the village of Rosslyn, near Edinburgh in Scotland, from the 15th century, one of the many decorations clearly represents the initiation ritual of the Freemasons. Together with Christopher Knight, Lomas published a detailed analysis of this in book form. So how did the symbolism of the ritual of admission to the first degree of Freemasonry, including the depiction of a Knight Templar, end up in Scotland's Rosslyn Chapel built in the 15th century? The man who had the chapel built was William Sinclair, the first Earl of Caithness from the influential Sinclair family in Scotland. The connection between Scottish nobility and Danish nobility emerged early on. The Scottish King James III married Margaret of Denmark, whose father came from the Welfen House of Oldenburg. William Sinclair, the builder of Rosslyn Chapel, traveled to the Danish capital Copenhagen in 1422 to claim the title of Earl and the possessions and privileges that came with it. It wasn't until 1434 that he got what he wanted from Eric VII of Denmark, with ancestors from the Duchy of Mecklenburg. William's daughter, Lady Eleanor Sinclair, married John Stuart, a relative of the kings of Scotland. Before King George I, ideologies didn't matter. All empires for thousands of years functioned more or less the same. The core ideology was obedience to the rulers. Freedom of speech was not a thing, and the populations were thoroughly surveilled, because more wealth and freedom for the average citizen would have ruined the imperial calculation. When modern printing methods in the 1500s made books and pamphlets cheap, ideas spread about half-breed systems between monarchies and republics, full republics, and even the socialist concept of taking the aristocracy's property and banning all future private ownership. Around the year 1700, modern science showed its capabilities, and empires wondered if the old ways were outdated. At some point, you would not need hordes of farming serfs any longer. Success would no longer depend on the size of farming land, but rather on how many citizens were in schools and in factories, to produce things that could make imperialism bigger than ever before. Individuals would need more individual liberty and assets, which means the covert control through intelligence networks would have to be improved. The royals had to hide their power behind political and financial front organizations. The British Empire was quick to adapt. The French monarchy moved very slowly and paid the price. Many influential Frenchmen wanted a half-monarchy or a full republic. Out of the chaos came the rule of Napoleon, and after his fall, the industrialization of France was not progressing fast enough. Officials in Britain's 13 American colonies demanded a full independent republic. The different competing monarchies saw themselves as the rightful successors to the Roman Empire. Even the Enlightenment groups did not want to fully break with the Roman traditions, but rather evolve them. A republic or half-republic could not avoid baseline imperial logic. The communists pretended to be the mortal enemies of Roman-style empires, yet the Soviet Union functioned in a Roman style and could not reinvent the wheel. In practice, socialism was simply a bureaucratic organized system of exploitation based on the older model of serfdom. Think about it, the classic serf had to work hard every day and could not acquire meaningful personal property, or choose better conditions elsewhere. The ideology was obedience to the aristocracy and the church. Transgressions were punished severely. The socialist worker was required to work the fields or in the factories, had no way of choosing better conditions elsewhere, could not acquire meaningful personal property, and had to adhere to the ideology, which was, at its core, just obedience. It should not surprise you that the aristocracy was toying with the idea of a controlled new version of serfdom, call it socialism or something else. It also seems as if the Americans lost the intelligence war against Britain. King George III and the political government seized the physical fight, yet the war in the shadows continued indefinitely. It defies logic and everything we know about empires and espionage to believe that Britain had not established massive intelligence networks in the American colonies from the very beginning. After the Revolution and independence, any number of assets could have been sent to the United States from Britain and German territories of Welfs, Wettins and Reginarids. North America was a coveted colonial territory, and therefore fiercely contested by Britain, France, Spain, Holland, Mexico and even Russia. Britain's famous 13 colonies, which proclaimed their independence in 1776, were located on the East Coast and represented only a small part of what we know now as the United States. Further into the American interior was the huge New France of the Bourbons, and further west and south there were huge areas under control of the Spanish Empire, whose monarchs were Habsburgs for a long time. For its 13 colonies in America, Britain not only needed classic control structures such as the military, trade and bureaucratic administration, but also secret intelligence networks. The Brits had a never-ceasing need for information about what the French and Indians were up to, as well as what their own colonialists were thinking. It was not particularly difficult to establish a dual system of colonial administration, the public arm and the covert arm. The king held all the cards from the start and was able to place loyal people in all sorts of positions, who in turn expanded the network through trade and family ties. There were eyes and ears everywhere that could regularly report on the mood in the general population and on possible spies from the Spanish and French. Britain's priority was to contain France. To prolong the war against the 13 colonies and their desire for independence did not make sense. There was always the option of continuing the war in the shadows through intelligence networks and regain control of the East Coast of America. And letting George Washington win had another massive benefit. The French opted for funding Washington and the 13 colonies instead of attacking them. The French monarchy was effectively wasting its money. You may remember the old saying, America is a republic as long as you can keep it that way. And to have your republic, you need to be able to perform counterintelligence, especially against these old networks. You can find the link to the book in the description below. The title is Royal Cryptocracy, Ancient Intelligence Networks in Enlightenment and Communism.